It was not, sadly, Justin Timberlake. So for those of you that were holding out for that, Amy, sorry. It was not going to be John Hattie either. So the double disappointment maybe on that front. But we were supposed to have today, and like I said, we'll be able to fill in this individual stead. You hear the audio? Dramatic build-up for Dave Burgess was supposed to join us today. So I don't know what's going on, why he's not around. But we'll fill in anyway. When we were talking about teacher credibility, I started reading through it. I was looking through all the DL Playbook materials, and I thought to myself, like, who is better at just being an authentic, kind of crazy, hype live, like individual when it comes to dealing with kiddos and being in the classroom, more so than Dave. And so hopefully he'll kind of maybe remember and jump in for us at some point. I'm prepared to share on this and would love to maybe just do some of this live. We'll make it up as we go. So I kind of themed the whole thing out a little pirate style here, and was it going to encourage everybody to join us for a conversation about teacher credibility, particularly in the remote setting. And so with that being said, why do this? Well, that teacher credibility piece is huge when it comes to that visible learning. We're thinking about effect size change. We're talking about a 1.09. Can you guys still hear me? I just got the thing that says I'm unstable. Okay. So that being said, if we're talking about a 0.4 being a place where we're starting to have some significant improvement, we're talking about almost 3 times that if we were to get up to that 1.20. Actually, 1.09 is one of the highest effect size impactors out there. And so this really, truly does matter in a very significant way. And so that said, we're going to look at it a little bit. We're going to talk about it and think through what it means to present ourselves, our teacher selves, our true selves in a lot of ways too, like as being credible leaders of that classroom experience. So this short definition here, if we just kind of want to add that, is from Fisher and Fry. I got this from one of their ASCD blogs that they had on this particular topic, that teacher credibility is the student's belief that they can learn from a particular teacher because this adult is believable, convincing, and capable of persuading students that they can be successful. And that's really critical to learning, right? This is the relationship piece that we can't just overlook. And so I'm going to ask for everyone, if you would, in the chat to just write down some of the components that you think kind of make up teacher credibility. If I even go back one, we're talking about things like believability, being convincing, capable of persuading. Would love to see what you collectively could kind of come up with here. And I'll try to get that chat window up so I can read some of these out loud for those of you that maybe don't have the chat quite as accessible. We're talking about being authentic, truthful, knowing your stuff. Very well said, Eileen. I appreciate that. Authenticity is an ongoing theme. Content knowledge, yes. Building student relationships, being consistent, follow through, with itness, reliable, being a real person, believing in kids, being organized, charismatic as a speaker, not afraid to look stupid in front of your class. Yeah, sometimes you got to be willing to be a little cheesy. I think that's A-okay to do. Let's see, flow the lesson, right? That it has like some rhythm to it, and there's a competence that comes with that. Humor, adaptable, and so many more. Keep adding those in. Good pace, planned. Love all those comments. So when we're thinking about teacher credibility, if that's kind of the end goal here, the ultimate where we're headed, we're going to follow this little path to organize our thoughts today as we talk a little bit about trust, competence. I struggle saying this word, so I'm going to say it before I say it the first time. Dynamism. Am I saying that right? And relatability. And so those are the 4 words by the DL Playbook, at least, that come up. And so we're going to delve into each of those in particular, understanding too that a number of the words that you brought up are either embedded within those or could be things we pivot to as a part of this teacher credibility conversation as well. So let's start things off. by leaving our ship and heading to a conversation about trust. So I was hopeful to have a conversation with Dave about trust. So I'm going to actually maybe just invite some people to share their thoughts on some of these questions that are here. The first two, happy to address either of those with anybody that might want to come off of mute and talk about it. But what does it mean for a student to trust a teacher? And it seems like a really, well, they trust them kind of answer to that question. But it's a little more nuanced than that. What might we say in terms of what that looks like?
I'd say not afraid to make a mistake based on what they say, especially in Zoom. I think that's a big challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. We're talking about trying to make students, it's a climate piece a little bit, right? That you're not going to, you can share and your thoughts are going to be validated, right? And it's a safe space to do that.
There's a confidence factor and a confidential factor, but that there's also this, that if I take risks, if I see my teacher taking risks, then I'm going to be okay taking risks, and that this is this mutual space. You know, that it went back to Mr. Hand and Spicoli, and Spicoli was saying that Mr. Hand was saying that he was wasting his time, and Spicoli says, well, if I'm here and you're here, doesn't that mean it's our time? You know, so that mutual space being together.
That's really
good.
I
think it's also about consistency, and that your kids trust that you're going to behave or react the same way each time, whether it's a different kid or the situation is tweaked a little bit. They have to know what to expect, and they have to trust that you're not going to wig out on them.
I love that, Michelle, because what you just said was consistency between kids. And that sometimes I get a different reaction based on what I say to a teacher than what my friend Johnny says to a teacher. And that's so transparent. I love that, Michelle.
I also think that the trust starts with knowing that they are physically safe in the classroom, that they're respected in the classroom. I always told my students that safety is my first job, respect is my second job, and teaching you content was my third job, and they have to go in that order just to build that trust that I will keep you safe.
Absolutely. Hearing elements of fairness in there. And Eileen brings up a good point too, with that competency, and that in some instances, it almost feels like there's like these are Venn diagram overlapped, right? Where trust is a part of competency, which would be the next one that we look at. And so what role does that play, this trust piece in this learning dynamic? And I'm hearing it now, you're feeling like you're going to get a fair shake. You're feeling like what you're going to say is going to be like honored and respected. How else is this supportive of learning?
Students aren't afraid to throw out ideas, or, you know, they're what they think kind of moments.
There's an engagement factor to that, right? When you feel confident enough to share, you're going to look for a place to step into the conversation. And so I certainly think that there's a lot of truth to that.
If kids trust you as a teacher, they're going to be more willing to put themselves out on that limb. And even if they don't know the right answer, they're going to come out and say it to kind of help fix it if it's wrong or anything. They're more willing to do that and put risks, even if you're showing to put risks out there, like was said earlier. If the kids feel that trust and that safe classroom, they're going to be more willing to do that, knowing the way that the teacher's going to react, but also the way the rest of the students are going to react to them when they answer, because it's teacher and the rest of their classmates, rather than a classmate saying, oh, why did you answer it that way, and making them feel, you know, a certain way for answering the way that they did. If they trust the teacher, but they also have to trust their classmates.
I like that too, Otis. I would add that if there is that trust relationship established, you're going to get more buy-in from the students almost automatically. And anything that I ask the kids to do, there's less resistance.
I think too, when they are not afraid of you and they're going to take more ownership of their learning too. So maybe they have a different suggestion for how they want to do that assignment, or have some sort of choice within whatever you're doing. But they know how you're going to react. They're not scared to give you suggestions, sort of thing. So I think that helps a lot as well.
I agree. I think that they know that their voice matters. Whether their teacher or their classmates agree or disagree, their voice does matter.
Absolutely. And so with all of these, and we start to think about being able to foster that trust, particularly in that remote setting, what are some things you've seen maybe that have helped to do that? Because I think that it is a bit more challenging, and maybe back to the point, and I'm hearing it consistently from everyone's comments, and that this is it has to be modeled, it has to be like built intentionally over time to reach a place where the culture in the classroom, or that's the case. And I think it's really challenging in this remote setting because we might be taking what would have otherwise been a 90-minute block and turning it into a 30-minute Zoom. Or in the case of elementary, for example, instead of spending 8 hours with your teacher, now you only maybe have 4 smaller increments of time. So what are some of the challenges and ways we can maybe try to make sure that we maintain that trust or foster that trust in a remote setting?
I'm thinking
This is
of,
section,
oh, go ahead, Sarah.
the section where the distance learning playbook maybe talks about those touch points. And I thought that was really interesting when you're able to be present as much as possible in a realistic, authentic way for your students. And it's not just like one recorded instructional video, but you're trying to, pop up as often as possible to interact with your students. And I think that helps to show them that you actually care about their learning.
I think that when you're allowing for the norms in your distance learning or remote learning classroom, and that you revisit those so students feel safe and they feel like they can trust you and you're going to be consistent. And, if you allow for kids to maybe have their cameras off or maybe to not have their cameras off, but you're flexible that way.
Yeah. Hey, there's somebody in the waiting room that I think we might want to let in at this point in time. And let's see. Can we give a warm welcome to, you joined in? Dave, are you in here? I just hit admit. There he is. What's up, Dave?
Hey, Stuart, can you mute?
So sorry.
Sure.
I got caught. I was panicking, driving as fast as I could to get back here. I knew there was some reason I needed to be home by 10.
It's all right. It's all right. I appreciate you, just taking some time, devoting some time to joining us today to talk through these topics. And so we did a little bit of fanfare off the top. We'll kind of go back and give you a little bit of sense of what we built up for you. So anyway, real excited to have you today. Thanks. We started to break down a little bit our conversation around teacher credibility. And we got in so far as talking about trust, and we're going to move on actually to competence here in just a second. And so we'll kind of maybe pivot to that now as we look to talk a little bit about that topic. So in the area of competence, what does it look like for a teacher to exhibit competence, and maybe how is this the same or a little different than trust? I know you're just getting settled, so I'll give you a second to kind of look it over and gather yourself. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so just to pop back real quickly to the trust thing, one of the things that Shelley and Beth talk about in Lead Like a Pirate that I think is important about trust is that they refer to it as the oxygen of a school system, in that it's invisible. You can't see it, but without it, you can't survive. And so what I think is important about that is like, you can go into a school, you can go into a school and you can look at the mission statement, you can look at all the stuff that's up in the signs, and you can hear what people are saying. And it could sound just the same in this school as it does in this school over here, or in this classroom as this classroom right here. But it's so wildly different. And you're like, what is so dysfunctional about this space, and what is so successful about this space? And it's because it's invisible. It's the trust. It doesn't matter what you say if nobody trusts you. That's sort of like student engagement. When I talk to teachers about student engagement, I say, like, it doesn't matter what you say if nobody's listening. Well, the same thing is true with trust, with a teacher to students, or for the leader to the staff, is that you can say all the right things, but if there isn't that rapport, that relationship, that level of trust between the people that are involved, it makes no difference at all, and it's bound for disaster. And so that's why, like, I always see people, I think they spend too much time crafting these powerful initiatives and not enough time on that real relationship building of investing over a consistent period of time in developing trust. So those are a little popping back to the trust.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's kind of been our conversation here too, is just like how integrated, it's almost inseparable from the word culture. And that it is kind of interesting how that can happen on a class by class basis, and what students feel in one space, they could, walk 2 doors down the hall and not feel the same. And so as that relates to competence, I do think there's some overlap there, if we were to call that almost like a Venn diagram, where there is going to be some shared space. But how are they also maybe a little bit different too, in your perspective of that?
Yeah, so I think there's a, you can trust someone, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the skill set necessary to do what they need to do. And so I think that's something that's super important, is that not only, it's not just the relationship. You have some people, for example, that are very great at connecting with people and building relationships, but they haven't put in the work to learn the necessary skills that they need to move people forward. And so they might be able to glad hand very well, right? Make everybody feel good, but maybe they don't have the skill set necessary to have that discussion about instruction, for example. For example, a leader that comes into a classroom and observes a teacher can leave a note that makes that teacher feel good and like they're appreciated, but do they have the ability to hold a discussion about pedagogy and about powerful learning experiences, and about and have a discussion that's going to move that teacher forward to the next level? Maybe that teacher might already be excellent, but does that administrator have the ability to move that teacher to the next level? And that becomes very clear, I think, especially if you have a master teacher, and that's where sometimes it breaks down, where you have where the teacher senses that maybe the person that's helping them doesn't have the requisite knowledge to move them forward.
Yeah, and I can think of some teachers I even had growing up who I absolutely loved as people and leaders and appreciated being in their class. But there was this distinction between them and the teachers who I loved every bit as much, but you could tell were really steeped in their content and employed great strategies and cared about, what we were doing as far as a learning experience goes beyond the relationships, and having both, I think, is really important. And so that said, with the competence piece, then how are we able to sort of convey that in that remote setting? I just think a number of things are at least not necessarily lost there, but just are more challenging in that space. And so maybe some ideas for what that might look like via video conferencing, for example.
Yeah, and just to pop back real quickly on the competence thing too, I said something kind of confrontational in my book, because I have spent so much of my book talking about presentational aspects of teaching, and sort of like the bells and whistles and things that you can do around the edges of your content to draw students in and to kind of magically connect them to the material. But I said, so before I really dove into all those presentational aspects, one of the things that I said in the book that gets overlooked sometimes is I said, hey, like, before we talk about all this, I'm assuming you know your content as a teacher. And then now we're talking about, hey, what can you do to make it more engaging for your kids? But I'm assuming you know your content. If you don't know your content, put this book right now down and go learn your content, right? And so sometimes that's something that gets overlooked that people kind of missed in the book. That, you know, I'm assuming a high level of content knowledge. And now let's talk about delivery systems to make it more engaging. I think the same thing is true in the remote. Is when I talk to teachers about teaching in a remote setting, I'm assuming that the content knowledge is rock solid. And then now let's talk about how do we connect with kids in a remote way. And so one of the things that I tell to teachers, I work with them on remote teaching, is just in, like, I can give, like, say, an hour keynote to a group, and I don't even have a slide, and it's in a Zoom conversation. Well, how is that even possible, right? Well, because what I'm doing is I'm using a two-dimensional screen in a three-dimensional way. And so I'm talking, I talk to them about, hey, listen, how are you using intonation? How are you using inflection? How are you using rate of delivery? Sometimes maybe you're gonna talk real fast in order to bring some real energy into the discussion. Other times, maybe you're gonna be more reserved with your students. You can move in and whisper like this and do this. I can disappear from your screen and then pop back in with a prop or whatever it might be. Because I see too many teachers who are enthusiastic and charismatic in a face-to-face space with students. But then when they get in front of a screen, it's not just the screen that becomes flat. They become flat as well in their affect and all of that. And so, as I mention all the time, people don't expect people to be enthusiastic about something that you're not enthusiastic about. So this is one of the new skill sets of being an instructor in 2020, is you have to learn how to generate enthusiasm and charisma through two-dimensional, through a flat screen. And so I want people, like when I'm doing a presentation for teachers, I want to feel like I'm like popping through the screen at them, right? I can move back and get big when I'm discussing something. I can, like, you know, talk about hooks, how you're going to draw students in with your hooks. So everything is done in a three-dimensional way for me here. And so I've worked very hard at trying to generate enthusiasm and charisma through a screen. And I think that's something that people are struggling with. They become this kind of talking head syndrome. And they've kind of lost all that personality, which is so important in face-to-face, but it's just as important in a remote setting too.
I totally agree, because I think that if we're not able to stand in front of a camera and deliver, right? Because I feel sometimes we get self-conscious, and that self-consciousness, like we carry it and we present that way, and students can see that. And I think that it chips away at this. We can be very competent in what we're doing, but if we're not confident, it isn't conveyed in the same manner. And so I think part of that too becomes thinking about like chunking your curriculum, right? And making sure that you've taken what you would have done in class and found a way to make that fit the new time frame, constraints, activities, things that you're able to facilitate through that video conferencing format there. And so, yeah, I do think that there's a number of things to kind of consider with competency in that space. We're going to pivot. Go ahead, Dave.
I was just saying, and giving up the whole belief that it's going to look the same and that it has to be the same, that you're not trying to do exactly what you're doing in a face-to-face environment in a remote setting. Like, just like let that go and say, how can I best deliver this same material now with the new constraints that I'm under? Actually, there's a great creativity. There's a paradoxical thing about creativity, is that people think that freedom leads to creativity. And it's actually often the opposite. Constraints and restrictions lead to creativity. And so now we have a whole new set of constraints and restrictions on us when we're trying to deliver in either a blended or a remote setting. And so now, but what that can do is, if you look at it as an opportunity to really have some innovation and creativity in how you're going to take this curriculum and transform it and to be most effective in this new space, and not trying to just continually trying to match what was done before. Too many teachers right now feel upset. They're upset because what they're doing doesn't feel as good as what they were doing before, and they feel kind of frustrated at their kind of feeling of a sense of lack of confidence in themselves in this new setting, right? And I always feel like, of course it doesn't look the same. Of course, it's a pandemic, right? Like the idea that this was not going to have a disruptive impact on your instruction is not realistic. And so we kind of just have to let that go.
Absolutely, and still be able to do your best to grow and to learn how to present well in this space and to project that competence. And so we're going to pivot now to point 3 on our road here to teacher credibility, and talk a little bit about dynamism. I said from the top, I have trouble pronouncing that word. But here's what I'm going to say. I think, Dave, this is one of the biggest reasons I asked you to join us today, in addition to the other terms, because I feel like this word makes me think of the way in which you approach education and the sessions that you share out in, and just the whole pirate mantra. But when we think about this, what are some of the common adjectives that dynamic people have or possess? Because as a definition, I guess I'll share this too, that dynamism is your enthusiasm for your subject and your students in this case. And so we can add some of those types of words to the chat if you would, and I'll pivot to Dave now and let him speak to this a little bit.
Yes, I feel like I jumped the gun. I should have looked ahead and see where we were going with this, because as we're talking about that with the being more, I think of the word charisma when I think of dynamism too, and that ability, that energy. And that energy, by the way, now I'm a kind of a somersault, cartwheel, pretty like over the top style of presenter, but that doesn't have to be you, right? That doesn't have to be you. I can think of a situation where I saw Maya Angelou speak one time, and it was in I think it was like 2015, I can't remember, but anyway, it was, so before Maya Angelou passed, I had a chance to see she was one of my bucket list things, to see Maya speak. I saw her speak in front of about 10,000 people, and she was in a wheelchair on this day. And so besides reaching over to grab a book off the little counter, she never moved the entire time. But for 45 minutes, she wove stories in a way which completely transfixed the audience. And in the end, they all came together to show the impact of a teacher in a person's life. And I had this strange sensation coming out of my eyes, like this watery sensation. I wasn't sure what it was. It doesn't happen to me very often. And I was like, what are these things like coming down my cheek right here? Like, oh, these are these things that most people must refer to as tears. I'm not used to having these before. And it was like this amazing, and all I could think of is that it was unbelievably charismatic, but without the normal trappings of what we usually consider to be charismatic, these things I was talking about before. And it was this sheer authenticity and the power of the authenticity and vulnerability that she was sharing with people. So sometimes I think that's where it comes from. It doesn't always have to be the somersault and the cartwheel. Sometimes it's just when we let our true selves, our true voice come through, and people can sense that authenticity and that vulnerability that you're coming to the discussion with. And that, I think that's something that draws people in too.
It's as you're sharing that too, it reminds me, I don't know, my mentor teacher, whenever I was a first year teacher, taught me a lot of things. I still to this day think he's one of the best teachers I ever had the opportunity to observe in person. And he said to me, he goes, you need to make sure that you show students that you're wired right. And he worded it that way several times. And I was so grateful for that. And I feel like I started to learn what that meant over experience and the years, and just that, you know what, when you're happy, be happy. And when you're sad, it's okay to have those things coming down your face, Dave. and the things that make you a little frustrated, it's okay to be a little frustrated, right? And I think all those things play into that authenticity that sometimes when we're up in front of a room of 30 individuals, maybe multiple times a day, that vulnerability is not a place we necessarily want to step into, because we want to be in control. And those two things can be at odds with one another sometimes. And so I think part of your dynamism, if I'm going to continue to botch that word, is really just being able to show you have the full range of emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, like I would point people to, it's hard, you can't talk about vulnerability without pointing people to the work of Brene Brown, for example, and some of her research into vulnerability, and the idea that too many people have seen vulnerability as weakness, and when actually it's maybe the most courageous thing that you can show. And so the idea that being vulnerable is weak is just absolutely not true. It's entirely courageous to be vulnerable in front of a group of people. And I think that students are some of the greatest BS detectors in the world. And, you know, they know, they can tell the difference. It goes back to that trust being the oxygen. They know the difference between someone who's putting them on and someone who's being authentic with them. And it could be a powerful thing.
Yeah, I was circling back to that trust piece too, as Eileen was sharing earlier, where I don't know that authenticity piece, and it is. There's so many overlaps here. What do we see though as maybe being some of the issues, and maybe we've touched upon it, right? I like what you're doing with hooks, and I like the idea of leaning in close and backing up to be dynamic via video conferencing.
Yeah, and so I think that the all these different ways. What I think is that people have this sense that I've seen lots of teachers say that they have built some of the strongest relationships they have ever had with some of their students in this setting. And that's kind of some people can hardly believe that, but it makes sense for me, because I think that what this has done is put a real focus on more of the SEL components of education, right? More of that social emotional learning side of this, and the understanding that, hey, you know what? Maybe the most important thing right now is not making sure we cover the next content standard, or that we get them caught up from what they missed, fell behind in last year. Maybe the most important starting place is just to check in with people and see and make sure everyone is okay, and create that psychologically safe space for people. And coming to the table of all this with the understanding that there's always trauma in the world, and there's always trauma in our students' lives and our lives as well. But now there's a whole layer of trauma on top of society. It's just kind of riding in the background over top of everything. And that, so really taking the time to make those powerful and strong connections is important. It's kind of, I look at it like, like if you've been in a space for a while and there's maybe some background noise going on outside, and you can't just understand why you're frustrated and why something is like you just feel on edge, right? And then maybe the sound stops. And for a long time, you had even you weren't even attending to the fact of what it was, but all of a sudden when it stops, you're like, oh, like that's what was going on. Like that was driving me crazy, but it had been there so long that it just kind of slipped into the background. That's how I feel kind of about the pandemic and COVID right now, is that like we're kind of used to this layer of trauma on top of everything, and it's almost disappeared in a sense, but it's still there. And then at some point when it goes away, we're gonna be like, oh my God, like that's what that was. Like that's why I'm like, that's why my anxiety is so high, and that's why all these different things are so high. And so I do think that one of the powerful things about this is that we can really begin to see, hey, these SEL components of education are critical.
It just makes such an opportunity to really connect with learners in that space, because it's so needed at this time. And so I think that kind of gets us to our fourth and final topic here of teacher credibility, and we're talking about relatability. And this is, and just to kind of steal some things from the resources from that DL playbook, but it's in what we say, it's in how we say it, and it can really be in every group dynamic, whether that's in person or remote, in the whole group or in small groups or in those one-on-one setting. And so when it comes to relatability, I guess, yeah, how do we think about that with our work, and also kind of grow in that way too, right? Because you're like, hey, be more relatable. And you're like, well, I try every day to relate and connect with people. And so what can we do maybe to be a little bit more intentional in our efforts to grow in that way?
So my thoughts on this are, I'll go down two different paths. So one path is sharing a little bit more of ourselves and understanding. People say that they try to create this line, like, here's my personal life, here's my professional life. And I do not like to mix the two, right? And I think that's a mistake. I think what is unique about you, your particular strengths and talents, your voice that you add to your classroom is what makes you most powerful and effective with students. Not only does it make you powerful and effective, but it also helps to build rapport with students too. And they start to see you as a person. For example, maybe I see someone, we've all been in that state where you see that space where you see one of your students outside of the school setting, and they're almost like shocked to see you, right? Like it's almost like they run into like a glass door or something, okay? Like I'm at the movies and all of a sudden I see it like, Mr. Burgess, like, well, what are you doing here? I say, well, actually, Stephen, I am a human being. I exist outside the four walls of my classroom. Like I don't sleep in the cupboards or anything. Like I've got a life. Right? Now that might be surprising for some students. But I think that's something I hear less often than I used to, because I've gone out of my way try to add more of myself to my classroom. I'm trying to bring more of myself to school every day, right? I'm trying to bring more of myself to school. And so I think that's one way that we do this. And then the other way is to really focus in on here's a secret category of hook. A lot of the hooks that I demonstrate in workshops are what I call human nature hooks. They're things that just engage human beings. Like if you hide something from someone, they want to know what it is. And so how can we tap into that, right? That's a human nature hook to me, okay? But there's another category of hook that's a secret category. And that is, rather than spending so much time trying to get students engaged with what we're talking about, we could take more time taking what we're talking about and tying it to what they're already engaged in. So students already have this wide array of interests, things that they're into outside of school. Do we know those things? How can we find those things out? How can we make sure that we know what their hobbies are? What are their extracurricular activities? What kind of music do they listen to? What television shows do they watch? What movie are they excited about that's coming out this weekend? What is the new game that they're all fired up about, right? That's just being released? Or what's the, do you know all those things? That's information I want to know about my students, because that's different ways that I can now tie my career. I can connect with them, build relationships, be more relatable with them because I understand what's going on in their world. But then also I can look for spots that I can tie my curriculum to those things. And so that's why, like you take something like gamification. And gamification, so like, look, we have all these students who are wildly into gaming and always asking this question. This is a question I always ask. So how can I use that? Like, what is it about gaming that's drawing kids in, and how can I layer those things into my classroom? So it's not necessarily that they're going to be gaming in your class, but what is it about gaming that draws them in? And can we layer some of those things in the class? Can we have opportunities for students to level up? Can we have side quests? Can we have choice? Can we have immediate feedback that they get? Like all these different things that make gaming exciting for them. Maybe there's some ways we can layer that in. So basically there's two kinds of teachers in the world. That picture I'm saying to this to you like 18 months ago. There's two kinds of teachers in the world. One teacher says, I'm a rational human being. I have a family to support. But if I see one more kid with a fidget spinner, I'm going to go to prison. I'm just going to kill him. Like there are battles worth fighting, right? A fidget spinner is one of them. I will choke a kid out for a fidget spinner, right? Okay, that's like one kind of teacher. The other teacher says, that got big fast. How can I use that? Like maybe I'm going to use it as a story prompt today. I want you to write a story about the greatest fidget spinner in the history of the world. Maybe we're going to have them bring them in actually, and we're going to see why do some spin longer than others, and learn the science behind like friction and different forces, different like that, all whatever it might be, right? And maybe we could use a 3D coder and make some. Maybe we could learn about how entrepreneurs take advantage of fads and trends in order to create businesses or whatever. There's all these different opportunities that we can use. So whenever you see something go viral in your student population, don't get upset about it. Ask, how can I use that? Our Buckminster Fuller has a quote that I love. He said, don't fight forces, use them. So that's part of being relatable, I think, is not only sharing some of ourselves, but also really focusing in on let's learn as much as I can about students and their lives, because those are going to be great opportunities and ammunition in order to use for engagement.
I love looking at both of those halves to that equation, and really appreciate what you're sharing there. I as a classroom practitioner myself, think about everything from, we used to do a love and a learn, which we actually do as a part of kind of organizationally now on Fridays, where everybody shares one thing they love, one thing they learn. You want to find a great avenue through which to understand what people are kind of thinking about, what they're interested in, where their passions lie. That's an awesome way to do that, and just asking students to do that once a week. And then also not just, again, becoming more attuned to the things that they're interested in, but also communicating the things that you're passionate about. I used to love even I'd start off class, kind of like a hook, I guess, in a sense, but I'd call it my 2 cents. And I would throw out something that was personal, that did feed into the lesson. So it wasn't just some random story. One of my favorites to share was, and I'll be brief with this, I used to, when I first purchased the home, I had a 20 by 10 piece yard piece of grass. Like I really had no yard at all, right? And so I chose, though, in that first summer to water that thing religiously 15 minutes a day. And my little like swatch of land looked amazing compared to everything else that dried up and died around it. And I took a picture of it one day and I ended up sharing it on a yearly basis in class. And I said, look at my yard. This yard, like seriously, went out. I care about it so much because you can see everything else was just dead, brown, yellow around it. And I said to him, isn't it incredible what giving 15 minutes of intentional time to anything during a day can do to breathe life into something that would otherwise die without it? And it's cool. It took like 4 minutes to be able to tell people, hey, this is my house. I don't just like live on the back of the door and just come to life for you when you walk in the room, back to your point. And I'm a real person. This is my, a little slice of my world and how I process it. And I hope that maybe others can step into that as well.
Yeah, I love that. That's a perfect example. Just that didn't take much time at all, but the impact was enormous.
So, and to Eileen's point from before too, you model it by stepping into that space first, and then listening. I think that's another thing worth saying here too, as we kind of like wrap up these 4, is that, how available are you to make that space so that you can actually hear other people? And I heard that in what you were saying, Dave, as well, I think, as far as being attuned to the things that are going viral in their world. So, gosh, with all of those, that's really a great start, I think, to thinking about teacher credibility, and trying to do that in that remote space. I will add too, I do look at all of us today right now, just like look at all the windows, and people are sharing that they celebrate holidays, that they're fun because they're putting filters on, or they have a different background, or I do think that music and all these other things allow you to be yourself in this virtual space. And so don't ignore those simple things. But that said, teacher credibility, Dave, we did it. So,
man, I'm glad that I apologize to everyone for being late and getting caught up there, but I'm glad I got a chance to spend some time with you. And again, thank you for offering me some grace with not getting back in time.
Hey, I appreciate you volunteering your time to jump into our lunch bunch, to help us all across the state get an opportunity to learn from you, and just to think about what it means to be a credit, to help our educators be more credible with their learners in a space where it's difficult sometimes to do that. I think it's difficult at all times, really, to be intentional as we get caught up focusing in on curriculum and what are we going to cover, and do we have enough time for this activity, to just slow down enough to make sure that those pieces don't get lost in the busyness of it all. And so thank you so much for sharing some ideas today. Anything kind of parting words as we close it out?
So make sure that intentional self-care is a big part of what you do right now as an educator. And, I think this is probably for most people, it's the last week before they head off into break. And part of the important thing about break is that you take one and that you are willing to unplug and disconnect a little bit from school. And of course, there's some things that maybe you want to work on and do, but also make sure you take some real time for yourself, for your family, and focused on your health and wellness, and all those things those are not selfish things. Those are things that make you better in the long run for your kids and for your students as well. And so break's coming, be sure to take one.
Absolutely. And I want to say too, a belated happy birthday to you, by the way.
Yes, my birthday was Saturday.
Yeah, hopefully you had a good one and got a chance to take a little break with the fam as well during that time. So, so thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everybody for joining us for today's lunch bunch. I will just do a quick preview and say that we are, and I'm going to fast forward through kind of our breakouts. We had an opportunity to chat all the way through that. But we are going to have one more lunch bunch session, which is going to come up on Tuesday, December 22nd. We're going to do this unconference style. I actually talked with Otis Pierce a little bit via email about this, where we're going to field topics in the session, breakout groups according to what you would request to have conversations about. And that'll be a really fun way for us to make sure that we're active and having fun, stay engaged in that last few days here before that break that Dave's sharing. I mentioned this from the top, but Catlin Tucker we had the opportunity to visit with her, Thursday, and have a conversation that she is okayed for us to add to the podcast. And so look for what I'm going to just call the sequel to having her back again to talk about remote learning, hybrid strategies. And then our Friday Love and Learn, as always, is coming up. So thanks for always being a part of the Lunch Bunch. Thanks again to Dave, and we just appreciate everybody. We'll see you next time.